It's like my own personal dance party music in the background of every broadcast. My name is Jesse Hildebrand, everyone, and I am with Exploring by the Seat of Your Pants. Welcome in as we continue on our epic climate change deep dive festival this week. So this week, we're going to have 23 programs in 5 days. This is our 6th program. We have talked about the Marshallese Islands getting sunk underwater by the effects of climate change. We've talked about Arctic change. We've gone up to Svalbard to hear from the ladies at Hearts in the Ice live from their remote cabin at Bumsaboo. This has been a really amazing festival highlighting scientists and explorers around the world talking about their work, understanding and helping combat the greatest challenge of our time in climate change. Today, I am particularly excited to have back Paul Sokoloff, who's one of my favorite speakers we have on this broadcast. He is a researcher with the Canadian Museum of Nature, an amazing organization and institution in Ottawa, Ontario, Canada, our great capital. If you ever get a chance to visit, they are truly spectacular. But in the meantime, since we can't visit quite yet, we're going to learn a little bit about Paul's amazing work virtually, going up to the high Arctic to study plants and do epic adventures. So without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Paul. Thank you so much for joining us today, and take us away.
Thank you for having me, Jesse. It's always so much fun to talk with you and with all the classes that are here today. So as Jesse mentioned, I'm going to talk a little bit about what we do at the museum in terms of research in the Arctic, and talk a little bit about how we are looking into climate change from kind of a baseline perspective, and I'll explain that in a second. So I am just going to go ahead and share my screen. Oh, there we go. All right. I'm talking today about plants and lichens from Inuit Nunavut, and I'll talk a little bit about what Inuit Nunavut is in a minute. But at the museum, I'm the one talking, but I'm also presenting the work of these fine people. What's that old cliche? It's the friends you make along the way. Well, these are all the wonderful people who I've worked with at the museum and in my research, not only across Canada, but across the world as well. Who have made this possible. And so, when I'm saying this is the research we do, I really want to highlight these fine folks here. These are the collections professionals, researchers, sometimes Martians, I can talk about that in the questions later, who make this possible. All right, so now if you tuned into this festival a little earlier, you probably already have the answer to this question that I'm going to ask, but I always like to start a talk by asking people to imagine what the Arctic is. If you've never been to the Arctic or you haven't seen pictures of the Arctic, because we have this, as Southerners in Canada, we have this perspective of the Arctic being cold and, maybe lots of icebergs and glaciers and this is we've got a zodiac of students here going by that probably pops up if you've heard of great organizations like Students on Ice. And this is true. This is the Arctic, part of the time, and sometimes in like ice areas and on especially towards the North Pole, this is what it looks like. But this is not all the Arctic is. The Arctic is a vast ecosystem in Canada, and it's filled, because it's so big, it's filled with all of these different types of habitats. You get these deep river valleys that host interesting ferns and shrubs, and have a really unique, what we call a microclimate, a warmer area and a colder area that hosts all sorts of diverse plant life. You can get lush willow thickets, like you see here in the lower left. In the low Arctic, this is Kugluk Bloody Falls Territorial Park on mainland Nunavut. And you get this is the super lush tundra, which is great for camping on because it's like the softest thing to lie on. In the upper right, you can get gravelly areas, places of limestone that shattered and looks a little bit like Mars. But if you look, you'll see that there are still plants there on the tundra. And then, of course, you can also get some very flat, glacially carved out areas like Lower Victoria Island, again in Nunavut. So the Arctic isn't just snow and ice, and especially in the Arctic summer, it is alive and full of plant life across the Arctic. And it's big, it's massive. In Canada, it's 40% of Canada's landmass. Now, there are different ways to define what the Arctic is. But, if I'm talking about every area above the tree line, which is how a botanist might think of the Arctic, that's what you see here in green. This is the 40% of Canada's landmass that our team is interested in the biodiversity of. Now, of course, you can define Arctic in other ways too. The Arctic Circle, of course. You can also talk about it in terms of northern territories. But in addition to being, for me, the zone above Arctic tree line, the Arctic is first and foremostly Homeland. It is where Inuit have lived for thousands of years. And in Canada, the Arctic is synonymous with Inuit Nunavut, the Inuit Homeland. And in Canada, that's made up of 4 different regions: Nunavut in Labrador, Nunavik in northern Quebec, the territory of Nunavut, and the Inuvialuit settlement region in Northwest Territories. And so by working in somebody's backyard, it's really important for us to keep in mind that, we're not just out there digging up plants on the tundra. We are there to work closely with communities. We are there to document the biodiversity of the area, but to also make sure that our information is useful to communities and gets back to them in ways that they can use and in ways that they find interesting as well. Because, as a museum, our job isn't just to make science for scientists, but to get the general public involved, to get everyone who's interested in plants excited about them. And that makes our work just all that much more enriching. And it's kind of honestly the best part of my job is translating science and doing things like what we're talking about today. All right, so I hope I've situated the Arctic in your mind. It's a homeland and it's in the northern parts of Canada, and we're interested in everything above tree line. Now I'll tell you what a botanist is. So that's what I do in my day-to-day job. I'm not a florist. That is somebody who arranges flowers for a living, and that's a perfectly valid career path. I think she's having a fabulous time here. No, the only time I arrange flowers is sometimes I'll put them on top of my head after about 3 weeks in the field and, prance around calling myself the king of beans. And that's because if you've been in the field before, you kind of you start to go a little like that. But that's perfectly normal. And I have wonderful colleagues who don't think any less of me, I'm pretty sure. No, so what I'm interested in as a botanist is I'm interested in how can I classify plant life? How can I take all of the plants that exist in an area like the Arctic and figure out, how many different species there are, how can I talk about them, and how can I put them into boxes that we can easily say, okay, well, this is what the biodiversity of the area looks like, and talk about that with other folks. So I like to start off by showing, kind of this slide of the bean family. This is the Fabaceae, and I'm a huge fan of this family. I actually did my master's work on them. And if you look at all of these photos, you see that they kind of go together, right? Okay, so there are differences for sure. Different flowers have different shapes, but they're similar in terms of shape. And they have different colors and different patterns on the petals. But if you looked at them, you'd say, oh yeah, those all kind of go together. We sort them. We do that really well. And so that's the plant family. We can further, kind of break it down and say, okay, well, all of these things are they look more closely like each other than any other part of the family. And so then we call that a genus. And then this is where we get Latin plant names. And so that first level of kind of this double-barreled plant name is Astragalus. This is the milk vetch genus. And by looking at all of these plants, we see, okay, well, yeah, they all look a little more like each other than they do the other members of the family. And so and we say, okay, well, that's probably all one good group, and they all go together. And then we can further refine that and break it down and say, okay, well, we have this individual species, and then this is called Astragalus botanii in Latin, or Botan's milk vetch, using the English common name. And so when we're giving it a name, what we're saying is that every time we see this plant, all of these individuals that we encounter are all one species. And we're pretty sure that they all look the same. They all have the same type of genetics. They're all genetically related to each other. And they all have one common ancestor that's separate from every other member of this family. So by giving it this name too, it provides us with this easy tool to talk about the plant. Because, if I have to say in every presentation I give, oh, the purple milk vetch plant that has, kind of this white pattern on it, but is really light purple, that's a long way of just saying, okay, well, I have Astragalus botanii. By giving it a Latin name, we can talk about it not only amongst other scientists, but with the general public. And by using Latin, we can talk about it internationally as well, because all plants around the world are given these types of names. So that's what we do as botanists. We're interested in classifying life. And by doing that, we can easily talk about it, and we can easily look at how climate change is going to affect plants in the Arctic, because we know there are so many species there, and we can keep track of that number and how it changes and how species distributions change over time. Now, of course, this is just one way of talking about plants. When I go up, I might say, okay, this is bog willow. I call it Salix fuscescens. But in Arviat, an elder might call it ukpik, which is the Inuktitut name in the local dialect for that particular willow. And if I'm talking to a Francophone audience, I might call it Saxophoage. There are different ways of talking about plants. And in the Arctic, there are different taxonomies and different naming systems for plants altogether. And so as botanists, it's really important for us to remember that, yes, we can talk about biodiversity in terms of the Latin names, and that's really useful for keeping track of things over time, but that's not the only way of looking at things. And it enriches our life to remember this. And by talking about plants in ways that people know already, we just make that experience so much richer for everyone involved. So different ways to call the same plant, really important. Okay, so across Inuit Nunavut, we think there are about 900 vascular plant species. And we say we think because each and every time our team goes up to collect some plants, we find a few new ones. And so these are a few examples of the plants that you might see across Nunavut, Northwest Territories, Northern Yukon, and Nunatsiavut. My favorite in the top left is the purple mountain saxifrage. This is the territorial flower of Nunavut. It's the first flower often to come up in spring, and sometimes it's these bright purple sprays, even when the snow is on the ground. And of course, maybe something I should keep in mind is that if you're an Arctic plant enthusiast, your macro lens is your best friend, because it's a little hard to tell scale in this picture, but this plant is only about yay big in real life. It's pretty low to the ground. And then in the bottom right, you'll see we have an Arctic willow, which again it's not that very tall. In fact, this is probably one of the tallest shrubs on Somerset Island in the central part of Nunavut. And so, these are different adaptations that Arctic plants use to survive in the Arctic environment. They grow low to the ground where they can absorb heat that as the sun heats up the ground, they kind of suck that up. But by also staying low to the ground, they're staying out of the wind. And that's a useful adaptation. If you look at the Arctic willow in the lower right, you can see it's covered in tons of tiny little hairs, and that traps a warm layer of air around it. And we know this is true. Like when I go out with my beard, it's like, oh, it keeps my face warm. It's kind of what's happening with that willow. It's keeping it warm in the Arctic environment. Now, of course, there are other types of flora that we're interested in too, not just these vascular plants, these plants that have roots and shoots and leaves. We're interested in mosses. We're interested in lichens, like this elegant sunburst lichen you see in the bottom middle. And we're interested in kelp and macroalgae and seaweeds and diatoms and phytoplankton, like the algae that you see in the bottom left. All of these things are what we are interested in cataloging at the museum. Because again, by figuring out, okay, how many species of, vascular plant, lichen, moss are across the Arctic now, that helps us, talk about how, especially tracking this through time, we're going to see how climate change is affecting these organisms in their habitat in the Arctic, which is the ecosystem Canada that is responding most rapidly to climate change. So how do we know how many different types of plant or lichen are in Inuit Nunavut? Well, a lot of this comes from survey work, and a lot of this is underpinned by our collection. So this is the National Herbarium of Canada, which is at our museum, at our facility that's just over in Gatineau. And what we have there is we have a large library of pressed and dried plants, just like this one that you see here in the middle. What we do when we go out into the field is we collect one specimen of every plant we see. We press it in a plant press like this. If you've ever pressed a flower in a book, that's really what we do for work. And by giving it a label that says which species it is, who collected it, when we collected it, and other notes about where we collected it, we essentially have this sheet, this pressed plant that says we found this particular species at this place at this time. And by keeping them in a collection, we essentially can build all of this data in one place about, okay, well, where can we find different Arctic plants? And by keeping the plants, not only can we go back and double check to make sure we identified the species right, but other people can actually come, other botanists or other people who are interested in taxonomy can come and see, okay, well, we have this species here, the purple mountain saxifrage. Maybe there's two species here, or maybe there are two subspecies. We can do this through looking at the morphology, by looking at how it appears. We can look at the DNA. And so by keeping it all in one place, we can really work to better understand that biodiversity. And this is open to anybody who's interested in biodiversity. It's not our collection. It's a national plant library open to anybody who wants to study plants across the Canadian Arctic. And we actually have plants from across Canada and around the world. And ultimately, that's what we're doing. Through field and lab-based research, we're really interested in figuring out, okay, how many different plants are across Inuit Nunavut? And by building that baseline, we're going to be able to say, okay, well, in 100 years, has the composition of the flora changed? Have the different numbers of plants across the Nunavut Northwest Territories changed through time? And so I mentioned fieldwork. That's my favorite part of my job. So in years when, this year we haven't gone up because of COVID, and that's great. Our first responsibility is to keep communities safe. But I'm hoping that one day we'll be able to do fieldwork safely again. So we'll hop on a plane like this one. This was built in the 50s, actually, but it still flies. It's in great shape. And we'll head up to a different part of the Arctic to collect plants and to answer new questions about a specific area and where Arctic plants grow there. We don't always use a plane. Sometimes we use a little bit of a low-tech solution, and we actually, canoe down a river to collect plants the whole time. We have a lot of fun while we do this too. Don't ever let somebody tell you that being a botanist is boring. It's actually there's a lot of adventure, and I have a lot of fun. And essentially what we'll do when we're out in the field is we'll have a field camp, and we'll spend about a month living on the land, collecting all of the different plant species in that area for us to work with. And so, everyone who comes into camp brings a different expertise. Some are people interested in mosses. Some people are interested in grasses. Some people are fantastic cooks. Some people tell good jokes. Essentially, we all bring something unique to that field experience. From our camp, we'll walk out onto the tundra, collecting each and every species that we see. We do bring firearms with us because we are in polar bear country, and so we have bear bangers, which are great for scaring away any polar bears, although knock on wood, we've never had a problem. And once we've dug up all of the plants that we're interested in, and of course we try to make sure that we're only collecting one so that we don't impact a local population, we'll squash it in that plant press, just like I mentioned. And once it's flat and dried, it will last. In a plant press just like this you see here, it'll last for hundreds of years. And that becomes that proof that we use when we're writing this up later on. And we can collect a lot in an expedition. Not only, a lot of flat plants, like you can see here. I think this is about 3 days of collecting for Roger, Jeff, and myself. But we collect a lot across the Arctic. And since our modern field program began in 2008, although we've been doing fieldwork for hundreds of years as a museum, we've collected in all these different areas across the Canadian Arctic. So bringing it back to that initial, a reaction of people thinking about the Arctic as snow and ice and glaciers, that's true. That's all true. But the Arctic is also amazing, stunning wildflowers in amazing places that across the tundra. And what we're doing at the museum is we're taking those plants and we're squashing them into beautiful specimens that tell us what Arctic plants grow in Inuit Nunavut and where can we find them. And in doing so, we're building that baseline for looking at climate change in the future. By figuring out what plants grow there now, we'll be better able to see what kind of impacts are happening in the long term. And of course, it's important for us to remember that while we are out on the tundra looking at all these plants with enthusiasm, we are sometimes also being watched as well by curious animals that just want to see what are all these botanists really interested in. And, they're really interested in plants. Well, sometimes we're the objects of interest too. So with all that, I will thank you for your attention. And I think we have time for lots of questions. So I'm looking forward to chatting.
We sure do, Paul. Well, thank you so much for highlighting some of your amazing adventures and some awesome photos. I love the wolf poking his head in the tent at the very end. We're going to get a question on that one in a minute.
Absolutely.
For anyone tuning in on YouTube, if you haven't let me know where you're joining from, please do share in the chat bar. I'd love to take some questions for Paul from there as well. Facebook, we are also broadcasting live, so wherever you're tuning in from, let me know and we'll keep the fun going. Paul, if you want to come out of screen share too, I don't know if you can see me right now. If you can, great. If you can't, by all means, exit screen share and we'll have a bit of a chat. Let's head to Seeley's class. They're grade 4 students. If you guys want to kick us off with a question and come on up, go for it. Hi, Miss Seeley's group.
Hi there. Anybody have a question?
What happens if you were to plant one of those plants in the Arctic in soil here?
Yeah.
Will it grow bigger?
Oh, that's a really good question. You know, it depends on the plant. Some species can come down south and do really well, but others are so well adapted to the Arctic tundra that they actually don't like the heat. They don't like the amount of sunlight. They don't like the humidity in the summer. I don't know. Ottawa in the summer is very sticky and humid, and that's not the Arctic at all. But it depends on the species. Others, you can actually get cultivars in garden centers that you can grow in your own garden. And they don't tend to grow very much bigger, although some, like willows, probably would, because they have this thing called phenotypic plasticity. They're really adaptable to their environment. But in general, Arctic plants are so specialized that not all of them would like it very much.
I don't think we've ever got that question for you from in one of our programs before. That was really great. So thanks, Mrs.
Great question.
Class. Maria, I know your group is joining as a homeschool, so let me know in the chat bar if you'd like me to come for a live question, and I happily will in a minute. Otherwise, I'll come back to Miss Seeley in a second. And again, any YouTube or Facebook viewers, don't be shy. Please do share there. Paul, what I want to ask is there a place that you haven't been in the Arctic that you'd really like to visit? Is there either another country or places in Canada that really have a special amount of biodiversity that you get to actually experience firsthand?
Oh, that's a great question. You know, I have to say, I don't know if I've ever thought of that. Often when we're planning an expedition, you know, we'll think about where we want to go, and then we'll think about what partners we need to work with. So we'll go up there. But the place that I really want to see one day is on the middle of Devon Island in eastern Nunavut. There's a place called the Flashline Mars Arctic Research Station. And people go there to simulate Mars missions, and friends of mine have gone up there, but I've never been myself, and I'd love to see it. It's actually a meteorite impact crater. Is like this large one. It's super well known. It's also well known as not being very biodiverse in terms of plants, but not many people have collected there. So I think I'd love to do that one day.
That would be fun. You're just going to get involved in all the Mars analog missions. Would you actually go to space if you were given the chance? Like if you could go to Mars, would you?
100%. Although I would really like to come back. You know, I think a one-way trip is not for me. I'd love to go visit one day.
That's fantastic. Thanks, man. All right, Maria, if you have a question, I can come to you guys. Just unmute your microphone and we'll come in a second. Hi, everybody.
Hello.
Hi.
Hello.
Just listen what he's going to say. Oh, the only one here.
Hi. Do you have a question for Paul? No worries if you don't, but if you do, by all means, you can share.
I don't have a question.
That's okay. We'll just keep tuning in and enjoy the presentation, guys. So nice to have you guys here. Let's head back to Miss Seeley's class. If you guys have another one, you want to unmute your microphone, come on back in. We'll see if we can take another from you guys.
Okay, who has one? Jada?
So in the museum that you work in, is there any artifacts from its history in it? Like, and are there any artifacts from the Arctic lowlands in there, like in the museum?
Oh, that's a fantastic question. So actually, our museum works with the government of Nunavut to preserve Arctic artifacts that belong to the government of Nunavut. And so, you know, while most of our specimens are pressed plants and dinosaur bones, we also have artifacts from a lot of different expeditions, but also artifacts from some Inuit sites. that we hold in trust for the government of Nunavut while they're working to build their own museum in Iqaluit, in the territorial capital. And so we actually have archaeologists on staff who are working with the government of Nunavut to make sure that those artifacts are taken care of.
I love that question. And if you're keen on artifacts, by the way, Arctic sort of archaeology, check out a presentation by Matthew Eyre. We've done a huge program series with him. He's amazing, done shipwrecks in the high Arctic, some of the coolest, most amazing science that we've ever featured on the broadcast. So cool question, guys.
Mm-hmm.
Paul, you mentioned this deep connection with Indigenous communities. You just mentioned this idea that we're working with Indigenous communities to build museums up in Iqaluit, to do amazing work linking in one way of knowledge and one way of seeing up in the Arctic, that for people that have lived there for thousands of years, is what you're doing with Western science in the museum. Can you speak a little bit more to that? Because this is a big topic that we're covering in a lot of our broadcasts now, is a sort of cross collaboration. And what's that experience been like for you personally?
Oh my God, it's been so enriching. And actually one of our most recent projects, dating back to 2016, is we have this partnership with Nunavut Parks and Special Places. And this is the territorial agency in Nunavut, which oversees parks, it oversees historic sites that belong to the territory. And what we're doing is we're actually working closely with them to catalog the biodiversity of sites that they're setting aside as parks, sites that the communities are interested in setting aside as parks, and sites that the territory itself thinks is really important to preserve. And what we're doing through that is we actually are working directly in communities and with communities on the parks, but also working with elders to talk about traditional knowledge that goes back to the community, and to work with students as well to train them in what we're doing. And they bring unique perspectives that are so valuable to that. And that's been hugely important to us. And then as a museum overall, we actually have a new Arctic gallery. When people think of the museum often, and if you've ever been to Ottawa, you've probably seen our building downtown. We have a brand new gallery that's all about the Arctic. And this gallery was specifically co-developed with Northerners. There was a panel that oversaw everything that went into it, but also Northerners have their own space within the gallery to tell their own stories. We call that the Northern Voices Gallery. And right now, actually, it's an exhibition called Kilalukat, which is all about beluga whales in the Inuvialuit settlement region. And that's curated by Myrna Pokiak from Tuktoyaktuk. So there are like that co-creation is really important to us, and I think it's really important to the folks who are doing Arctic research right. That's something that drives me to do better.
Yeah, that's a great answer. And I mean, I had the chance to see the Arctic exhibition in person. It's an amazing gallery. I hope for any of our students in the Ottawa region, even if you're not, take the drive. It's a really, really fun and special place to check out in person.
And actually, I can mention it's online. You can tour it online right now.
Excellent. Very exciting. It's been so nice to see the slew of museums, zoos, aquaria doing these amazing virtual programming opportunities over the course of the pandemic. Hopefully, we're all back in person soon. But in the meantime, if you guys are here checking us out virtually already, maybe that's something you can check out when you're done this broadcast. Paul, before we go back to some of our live groups for a second, I wanted to ask how you got into the Arctic. Was it something like serendipitous? You're in school and you got linked to go there. Did you always have a passion for these northern regions? What led you to this really amazing environment?
That's a really good question. I think it was actually plants that brought me there. And the reason I say that is because I came to Ottawa initially, oh my God, 16 years ago now, to become a science journalist. I went to Carleton University because I actually wanted to be somebody who writes scientific articles, kind of like popular science, people like Ivan Semenek at the Globe and Mail. And while I was there, I would walk by the greenhouses at Carleton's campus a lot. And I thought, oh, I really want to I want to go in and I want to see what it's about. And actually that kind of became the clue to me that actually maybe I wanted to do science more than just science writing. And so I switched into bio. I became interested in plants, and then I got involved with the museum as a master's student at the museum. And there I was interested in, okay, well, my project there was actually about plants in southern Labrador, which was interesting to me because I'm actually from Newfoundland and Labrador originally. I was born in St. John's. And by going back and getting to know those plants, I was like, oh, this is really what I want to do. I really want to be a botanist. just after I finished my master's, like I think it was like a couple days after I handed my thesis, there was an opportunity for me to go to Victoria Island, the Northwest Territories side, on an expedition with the museum. The museum's been doing Arctic expeditions for over 100 years, and they actually needed somebody who was a botanist to help out. And so they said, "Oh, do you want to come?" And I said, "Yes." And at the time, I thought that would probably have been my only trip north, until I realized how much I loved it, and a job came up at the museum, a permanent job. And so through that's how I got involved in the Arctic. And that was almost 10 years ago now. So I've just been, every time I go up, I learn something new. And I've grown more interested and more passionate about that kind of work ever since.
Yeah. I love that story. And so many of our speakers, explorers, scientists alike, start with some serendipitous opportunity where they get the chance to go on a voyage or go on a research expedition. And it's funny how taking those opportunities, going outside of your comfort zone and trying something completely new, even if you're a little afraid, can often lead to really, really exciting and fantastic career paths that people, really couldn't have foreseen at the get-go. So I'm really glad you shared that story. Thanks, Paul. Miss Seeley's class, come on back in. Let's unmute that mic. By the way, Naomi Rose on Facebook wants to say you look great and she loved your presentation. She hasn't seen it in a while. So there you go. Colleagues and friends galore. Miss Seeley's group, come on in. Hands up everywhere. Hands up everywhere.
If you looked into the ocean at the Arctic, how scary would it be?
Oh, well, I think it depends. I've definitely gone swimming in the Arctic Ocean, so maybe not that scary. In 2015, actually, I joined an expedition called Students on Ice, which is Students on Ice is a partner of the museum, and they take students from around the world on polar educational trips, so both to the Arctic and to the Antarctic. And they always do a polar dip as part of this. So I just had to, I had to jump in. I was not ready at all, but my friend on the expedition made me. So that was totally fun. So maybe not that scary. I think the things that I would be a little hesitant around are things like giant icebergs, because they're really close to go by, but sometimes they flip. And that's less that's something I'd want to steer clear of. It's also really cold, it's quite cold. So that's something to keep in mind. I think the things that we think about in terms of what do we want to prepare for are, I mentioned polar bears. Well, polar bears are marine mammals. They're close to the coast. So we always want to make sure we're kind of aware of our surroundings. And because we are, typically not based in a community, we're typically on a camp out in the land, we try to be ready for everything. And so that means having, survival gear, having satellite phones, having communications equipment to just be ready. So, a little bit of fear, yeah, you sometimes feel a little bit of it, but by being prepared, we can mitigate that. We can try to get past that. If that answers your question.
That's a great answer. And I love that message of being a little bit afraid, but being prepared. So Jill Heinrich, one of our favorite speakers we have on this broadcast, she's one of the elite divers in the world. She does all her dives a little scared. These are high-risk activities. It's something where it really pays to have that level of preparation, to recognize that there's real danger here, and to take precautions accordingly. Our last broadcast, right before you, Paul, we had Jessie Cramian on. She was talking about the Mosaic expedition in the Arctic, and that they had polar bear guards, people with weapons that were ready in case necessary, and hopefully never necessary. But that is something for space expeditions, for deep sea expeditions, and for Arctic expeditions that's really, really important to prep for. So great answer. Kelly joining us in Calgary. Welcome in, Kelly. She's on YouTube. She wanted to know, have you observed any changes to plant life or distribution since your early Arctic visit? So over your time going up there, have you noticed personally a change? If not, that, I think we're expecting maybe so, but yeah.
That's a really good question. So I haven't personally seen the change, but I've spoken with people who have. And so in communities, a lot of elders will talk about, okay, there are shrubs here where they weren't before. And those are stories that are really important for us to hear, because that's firsthand evidence. That's people who have seen it with their own eyes. And so by working closely with communities, we're actually better able to say, okay, well, maybe this is an area that we really need to go check out because we know it's changing. Now, there are things that we can see. Coastal erosion in the Western Arctic, so Fort Sea, in and around Tuktoyaktuk. I was also on an expedition there, and there you can see these large chunks of the coast basically falling in to the sea, and you can see actually the permafrost in there. And this is as weather is changing, it's eroding this landscape. And on top of all of that are plants and lichens. And in fact, there are globally rare plants and lichens in the Western Arctic whose very habitat is falling into the sea. And so those things I have seen myself.
I'm really happy you mentioned this, because one of the things that I think is really important for kids to understand about climate change is that, you hear about the Arctic land masses falling in, you hear about coral reefs bleaching, the Amazon rainforest disappearing, and these are huge, large-scale things that are very, very far away. I'd really encourage every one of our students today to ask your parents, ask your teacher, what changes they've seen locally in your own lifetime. I'm 28, and I can tell you that there are birds in my neighborhood now that never used to come to my neighborhood. We never saw them when we were kids, ever, and now they come up because their range has increased northward over time. We never used to have real big flooding events here in Toronto, and now every single year we have flooding events as a result of climate change. And I mean, you can ask adults in your life and get these sort of stories from everybody. I'm sure, Paul, your experience in Ottawa has been different over the last 16 years of what it's like, right? It's 16 degrees outside now.
Absolutely.
March, and that's a very, very unusual situation. Paul and I used to walk uphill in the snow both ways to get to school in March. So it's a very different time. So I just think that's a really important message for you guys, and I love that you could highlight some of the big changes that you've had the chance to see. But wherever you're joining from around the world today, ask those sort of questions to the adults in your life. Paul, this is super, super cool. I could talk all day about all this. This is fantastic. Is there any, for people going to the Arctic for the first time, for people who've never seen the Arctic, what would you recommend going to the Arctic? How would you recommend getting there? This is a place that's slowly but surely opening up to so many people around the world. Do you think it's important for Canadians or people around the globe to actually get up to the Arctic to see this in person? And how would they do that, in your opinion?
Oh, that's a really great question. And I think seeing it really kind of, in my mind, kind of formed a lot of, okay, this landscape is really important. But I think maybe the first thing that I would recommend to everyone who is interested in going up to the Arctic, and you can fly there, you can get on Canadian North and take a jet, but is to be aware that you're a guest. And this is something that I think about when I go is okay, well, even if I'm out on a fly camp, I'm maybe 200 kilometers away from the community, this is still somebody's backyard. And so that means taking the time to listen and to work with communities and to know a little bit about the community that you're going into, to be respectful guests on the land, so to live light on the land. And to keep in mind that your experience is so much enriched when it involves being in the community. And actually, as an example of that, a couple of years ago in 2016, we spent a whole month in Arviat. And this was our whole month, at least my first month, where all of our fieldwork was based entirely within the community. We stayed in the community, we went out on the land from the community, we always came back to the community at the end of the day. Arviat itself is just this wonderful hamlet. It's so friendly. And by being in there, we got to talk to people every day. We got to talk to people of all ages. When we were going to the store, we were walking down the street, we did an open house. By being immersed in that and by being respectful and by listening, it was just such an enriching experience. And so I definitely encourage people, if you can check it out, I would. Be mindful of that. You'll have a better experience if you chat with the people you meet along the way. And this is especially relevant right now to any classes that are joining us. If you're interested in seeing the Arctic, check out Students on Ice. I've mentioned them before, but they do have a program where you can apply for scholarships to go on these expeditions. And so check them out. They do this really well. They have amazing partnerships with the communities and with territorial governments. Have a look.
I'm so glad you mentioned them. Students on Ice is one of the favorite programs we've ever had on this broadcast. The team behind them were essential in organizing the Canada C3 expedition, which is also an incredible project. We had the pleasure of partnering with them on their entire expedition across Canada with their amazing ship. So, Paul, this has been so much fun. Time flies when we're having fun. So we're near the end of the broadcast. What I want to do is bring up nature.ca. If you want to see that Arctic I'm having the hardest time with that word today. Exposition, not exposition. Exhibition, there we go, Arctic exhibition virtually. If you want to see more about the museum's collections and all the amazing work being done there, check out nature.ca. Paul's on social media. You can check him out online very, very easily after this broadcast. And so I just want to say a huge thank you personally for joining us today. I really, really appreciate your time.
Thank you for having me. It's always so much fun.
I'm going to bring in Miss Seeley's class and Maria just to say a quick thank you and goodbye. If you guys want to unmute your microphones and join me in saying farewell.